In this short video, I'd like to take a look at one famous little excerpt from C.S. Lewis's book, Reflection on the Psalms, and in particular, to consider whether what Lewis is proposing offers an effective response to the problem of the imprecatory or cursing psalms. So the first thing I want to say is, like virtually everyone, I love C.S. Lewis. I think he was a great thinker. And he's, one of the great things that I appreciate the most about him is he was not a conservative evangelical. And yet he can express himself in such a way that conservative evangelicals are not threatened by his ideas, even though they would be threatened by those same ideas if they were coming from virtually anybody else. And I think that tells you something about trust. So C.S. Lewis at the end of The Last Battle, the Narnia tale, can really make a pretty striking statement about inclusivism, the idea that by worshiping this false god Tash, one might actually be worshiping the true god Aslan. And he can just kind of slip that in there in a narrative, and anywhere else, evangelicals would pull their hair out and they would scream pluralism or something else. But because it's in C.S. Lewis, he kind of flies under the radar, and they're maybe even open to the idea. And I think that in Reflections on the Psalms, he does something similar. So to his credit, C.S. Lewis is never one to shy away from the difficult questions. And in this book, he has one of his first chapters, chapter 3, on the cursing psalms or the imprecatory psalms. I can't remember what the statistic is, but it's something like maybe 1/5, 20% or maybe 25% of all psalms include curses for enemies. Some of them can be just downright ugly. And I love the way that C.S. Lewis begins the chapter. He says, in some of the Psalms, the spirit of hatred which strikes us in the face is like the heat from a furnace mouth. So I think I love that image. C.S. Lewis is certainly a master of metaphor. And I mean, here the idea that some of these Psalms where they talk about the backs of their enemies being broken and their teeth being knocked out and their children being childless and bathing your feet in their blood, their names being wiped from the book of life, all of these things are kind of like a slap in the face. It's like a furnace mouth. Like if you've ever been with somebody and in a fit of rage, in a peak of rage, they suddenly curse someone or use a racial slur or something else that's just shocking, and it's like it's a furnace mouth just blasting you with what they had to say. And C.S. Lewis here is saying, well, that's something like these cursing psalms. I mean, already the way that he frames the question is, for me, a breath of fresh air, because there's so many evangelicals that because of a particular way they're committed to reading the Bible, they're committed to finding everything by every author in the Bible to be good and noble and praiseworthy. And so they're not allowed to consider possible readings that are just the most natural, obvious readings, that some of what is being said here is ugly and not to be emulated. And Lewis is not hamstrung by this assumption. He's not forced into this Procrustean bed where he has to assume that there must be some particular morally praiseworthy way to read these texts. He says, no, this is like heat from a furnace mouth. And then he goes on and talks here about Psalm 109. And then later on in the next page, he says this, even more devilish is one verse. This is at the top of the page there. Even more devilish is in one verse is the otherwise beautiful Psalm 137, where a blessing is pronounced on anyone who will snatch up a Babylonian baby and beat its brains out against the pavement. And then he goes on. Throughout the chapter, he considers more examples of these shocking curses. So Lewis, again, he's not forced to some particular reading of the Bible. He's willing to recognize that this is like a blast from a furnace mouth, and it's ugly and it's mean. And the question is, what do you do with it? What is it doing in the Bible? Now, C.S. Lewis's answer, he considers a couple different answers. One thing that I'll just note here that, again, I appreciate is that he challenges directly later in the book this assumption that just because something is in the Bible, it should be good or morally praiseworthy. More specifically, just because something is written down by an author or contributor to Scripture, the assumption that it should be good or morally praiseworthy. No, Lewis says. These are not curses to be emulated. Having said that, and that's something that I appreciate about the way that he challenges certain other readings, such as those that are common among many evangelical Christians. He also says something that I think is really quite unhelpful, although I want to give him kudos or credit for exploring this as a possibility. I just don't think it works. And so for the remainder of this short video, I want to explain that. And what I want to talk in particular about is this idea he explores of allegory, of allegorizing the text, treating it symbolically. Now, this is, of course, an ancient practice in the Christian church. It sort of fell out of favor starting at the Renaissance and the Reformation, when Christians sort of became more intently focused on the historical grammatical interpretation of texts, seeing that as an anchor to delimit the possible range of meanings of the text. But for much of Christian history, Christians would explore other meanings of the text, anagogical, allegorical, tropological readings. So you have what is often called the quadriga, which would be this fourfold exploration of the interpretation of Scripture. And at the core of the quadriga, this idea is certainly the idea that there could be spiritual or allegorical meanings along with the literal meanings. And this could do all sorts of things. But one thing that this kind of allegorizing of Scripture could do would be to offer Christians another way to interpret or appropriate and apply otherwise morally problematic content. So, for example, in the early church, when Origen talks about the occupation of Canaan and the eradication of Canaanites, and he allegorizes it. So he talks about spiritualizing it in terms of the eradication of sinful impulses within the life of the Christian. So that's a way to interpret it as individual sanctification and a model of that. Now, he doesn't go on and just say it never happened, but he does offer a spiritual layering on the text, an allegorizing of it in order to deal with or accommodate for difficult moral content. C.S. Lewis finds himself trying to revivify this tradition in the 20th century in his reflections on the Psalms here. So I want to turn now to page 136, where he does this quite explicitly. And so we'll just join in progress as Lewis is talking about this and take a look at what he says. He says, I can even use even the horrible passage in Psalm 137 about dashing the Babylonian babies against the stones. I know things in the inner world which are like babies, the small infantile beginnings of small indulgences. So the infantile beginnings of small indulgences, small resentments, which may one day become dipsomania or settled hatred, but which woo us and wheedle us with special pleading and seem so tiny, so helpless, that in resisting them we feel we are being cruel to animals. They begin whimpering to us, I don't ask much, but, or I had just at least hoped, or you owe yourself some consideration. Against all such pretty infants, the dears have such winning ways. The advice of the psalmist is the best. Knock the little bastard's brains out. And blessed is he who can, for it's easier said than done. Okay, first thing with Lewis here, again, he can say stuff that no other evangelical can say. Which other evangelical can say knock the little bastard's brains out about an infant and get away with it? Somehow C.S. Lewis can get away with this. But now in terms of the actual explanation for the text, so what he's doing here is he's saying that we should, one way to appropriate this text, a morally difficult, problematic text, is to say, well, maybe we can think of it symbolically in this great allegorizing tradition. And we can say, well, we ought to think of these infants as, they look innocent, but in fact, if we think of it as analogous to particular sinful impulses with us. So this is much like Origen treating the Canaanites. If we think about it as analogous, the sinful impulses within us, then as the impulses grow, at first they seem innocent, but eventually they take us over. And so these are now infants in our lives, these sinful impulses, and we need to eradicate them at this point, even though they look innocent, because if they are allowed to grow further, then they will become dangerous. And that's Lewis's proposed allegorical reading. I just don't think that this is a good way to appropriate this text. And I'm just going to give you a simple illustration why, because of course you can take any text, no matter how horrific at this point, and appropriate it in this way. You can appropriate it. So For example, let's say that there was a text about torturing and raping a woman. And so it says, the graphic description of this woman being kidnapped, tortured, raped, and then killed. Well, then again, I mean, if C.S. Lewis can apply this to this kind of retaliatory, retributive infanticide, you can apply it to anything. You can apply it to a woman being kidnapped, raped, tortured, and killed. So you could just say, well, I think that what we should do is think about that woman as she's like a sinful impulse, right? That it becomes, if you don't go after it directly and pummel it and crush that sinful impulse within you and develop moral, spiritually forming aptitudes in which you pursue goodness rather than the impulse that is wicked and evil, then it will dominate you. You need to destroy it. You need to rape that impulse and kill it and get rid of it. Okay, I mean, I guess you could argue that kind of thing. Frankly, it just strikes me as crazy. I think what you should do is, if you encounter a text which is describing a horrific action like raping and killing a person, and there's no sense of irony in the original author expressing this opinion, right? That they're not actually diverging themselves from the moral impulse described within the act. They do seem to be endorsing this action. Then to me, it just seems, no, you don't appropriate that. You speak out directly against it. You indict it. You reject it. You condemn it. Now, of course, there may be other reasons why this text is included, but your response as a reader should be to reject the moral content expressed by the original author here and not try to symbolize it or allegorize it and appropriate it in some other way. And I think that this is just the same when it comes to this kind of retaliatory infanticide. No, you don't do that. You don't retribute these people who have done a horrible thing against you. I mean, if you read through this Psalm 137, they haven't done horrible things against the Israelites. It is almost what we would today call a cultural genocide. They're trying to assimilate the Israelites into Babylonian society and eradicate Israelite culture. And that is horrible. And it should be condemned. But to respond retaliatory by wanting to kill their infants, I think that we just need to say, while psychologically you could understand a person feeling that way, you can't appropriate it. It's just a mistake to appropriate it. And it's also a mistake to justify it. It's also a mistake to justify it in this indirect way by imposing some new spiritual meaning on it. So while I really admire Lewis generally, and I think he has a lot of good to say on the Psalms, and I appreciate how he honestly deals with the moral difficulties with the text, I nonetheless have to say that I just don't think this works.